This question, we are on a section called the forces of genetic changes in populations. It's our biology standard SB6D. I got this directly from a CK12 assignment, which was natural selection. I had this on several tests. So if we look here, these are your types of natural selection. Disruptive selection produces a graph that results in your two extremes not making it, basically. Okay, this would be like having a super small organism and a super large organism not surviving to produce more babies, and so the organism that's in the middle is what is actually surviving and producing more babies. Okay, all right. Stabilizing selection is where you have something very small, and this is just an example, maybe something very small that exists, something very large that exists, but the middle, the the phenotype or the trait that is in between doesn't exist. And so you get members of the population that are either small or big, but not in the middle. Okay, directional selection is whenever you go in one direction. Like originally, there was some big, some small, a bunch of medium sized organisms. Again, just an example. But the extreme that ended up surviving and producing more offspring were in one direction. It could be in this direction or it could be in this direction. But the reason that this was a level one question and that you should have gotten it right, only 34% of you did. We have had this is a word for word from a CK12. We have had it in at least two notebook quizzes before. And so this one you should have gotten right. Which description best describes the above graph? And with directional selection, they cannot all be correct. Phenotypes in the middle range are selected against. That doesn't fit because it's selecting for when we say something is selecting for something else, we mean that whatever's being selected for, those are the ones that live and produce the offspring. So in this case, if we were looking at large beak sizes versus small beak sizes for birds, it would mean that you started out like a million years ago with birds of all kinds of beak sizes. But later on, today, maybe we only see birds living in this particular place with larger beak sizes. So the population has shifted from including all beak sizes to just the larger beak sizes. Okay, so that means that one of the two extremes is selected for. All right, so the extreme, an extreme is something way over here or way over here, not in the middle. And so the answer here is C. One of these two extremes is selected for. And I was pretty disappointed that not more of you got that because we kept seeing it on notebook quizzes. It was word for word a level one question from your CK12. And anytime you see charts, graphs, bold words, you should have those written down in your notebook. Part 4 was Biodiversity of Populations. That is element SB5a. A species of rabbits lives in a meadow where grass plants are readily available during summer months. The rabbits do not stray from the meadow because the plants supply food and protection from predators. One summer, a fire destroys the plants in the meadow. As a result of the absence of plants in the meadow, the rabbit population will probably do what? Now, 84% of you got this right. which means that, still 16% of you did not get this right. If you take away the food that something eats, you take away its protection, they're going to um, decrease. The population is going to decrease because there's not as much food to eat, there's going to be more competition, and there's not protection there. So, decrease. This question, most of you all got this one right too, pretty much a common sense thing. The diagram above the food web, the arrows mean eaten by. What will happen if the number of snakes go down? Okay, so instead of having 100 snakes, maybe you've got 20 snakes. Well, the owl will eat the grass. That doesn't make any sense. Owls do not eat grass. The number of frogs will go down. Not. I'm not thinking so, because if you only have 20 of these eating these, you'll probably end up having more frogs, I would imagine. Okay. The hawk and owl will have less food. So that makes sense because the hawk, here's the hawk and the owl, they're going to have, instead of having 100 of these to eat, they're only going to have 20 of those to eat. That one makes sense. So that's probably the correct answer. The number of mice and grasshoppers will go up. Okay, so let's think about this. If we only have 20 of these instead of 100, that means you're going to have more of these frogs. If you have more frogs, that means probably you're going to eat more grasshoppers. So that one doesn't make any sense either. So the answer here, C, the hawk and the owl will have less food. That one is kind of a common sense question, and it looks like 78% of you all got that one right. Just remember, the key to this, if you're having trouble interpreting a diagram, sometimes, like I had told y'all before, make up that little story to go with it. Like say, okay, I've got 100 snakes and the number of snakes goes down to 20. So that means only 20 snakes will eat frogs. I'll have more frogs. If I have more frogs, then I'll have more of these. So sometimes that's the little test taking tip that I would give you to get this one correct. All right, I can look at this and without even thinking about it, I can expect this to be low. 38% of you all got this one correct. The reason I can expect it to be low is because you have to read. All right, and anytime I have long questions where you have to actually read a bunch of stuff, I know that one of the things we do, which we shouldn't do, is we stop reading and we just start selecting. Okay, another thing is that this is a higher level question because you really have to infer something. This is not a word for word definition type of thing. So if you go with me on this, the image above, and I kept out the image so I could have room and you could see this. The image above is of a kelp bed. In ideal conditions, kelp can grow up to 18 inches per day. In stark contrast to the slow growing corals, giant kelp canopies tower above the ocean floor. Like trees in a forest, these giant algae provide food and shelter for thousands of fish, invertebrates, and mammal species. Some storms and weather events like El Nino can dislodge the kelp, leaving a tattered forest to begin its growth again each spring. Sea otters and sea urchins play a critical role in the stable equilibrium of this ecosystem. Sea urchins graze kelp and may reach population densities large enough to destroy kelp forest at the rate of 30 feet per month. Urchins move in herds, and enough urchins may remain in the location of a former kelp forest to stop any regrowth. All right, so automatically all of these start out with the keystone species is the what? All right, so you know that you have to think back to that definition. A keystone species is something that is really important. The whole ecosystem would collapse without it. And so two of these start out with keystone species is the kelp. If the kelp is reduced or destroyed, the basis for the entire ecosystem is destroyed as is the ecosystem. And that makes, that does make some sense. Let's keep on reading. Keystone species is the kelp. It is the foundation for this ecosystem. If destroyed, it would be replaced by another producer to establish a different ecosystem. Okay, B cannot be, because B cannot be. Um, B cannot be the answer, because you're saying that kelp is a keystone species, but then here you're saying that, oh, well, if it's destroyed, something else would come in and get it. That goes against what a keystone species is. So I'm eliminating B. Let's read C. Keystone species is the sea otter. Sea otters playing a critical role in containing the urchin populations. They prey on urchins and thus control the numbers of kelp grazers to maintain the forest. Well, that makes sense, because you got a sea otter and they're maintaining the forest. They're preying on urchins so that the urchins don't eat the forest away and keep it from growing again. So C really makes a lot of sense. I haven't thrown out A yet, though, because I'm going to do some comparisons here, but let's take a look at D. Keystone species is the sea urchin. If the sea urchin species is greatly reduced by an increase in the sea otter population, the kelp beds would continue to grow unchecked and other populations of herbivores would grow. That one doesn't make sense, because we're not getting any indication that um, that the continued growth of kelp would be dangerous. Okay, so that one doesn't really make sense. So I'm down to looking at, is the keystone species the kelp, or is the keystone species the sea otter? So remember, your keystone species is going to be something that keeps other things in check. It's going to be, um, you know, like the gopher tortoise that is going to build a burrow that's going to be a home for many other organisms, or the red cockaded woodpecker, which is going to build little shelters in the trees, and then other organisms are going to use that little nest in the trees that they build whenever they leave it. So a keystone species doesn't just involve itself, it involves other things. So really your correct answer here is going to be C, that your sea otters play a critical role because um, they prey on the urchins and they control how many of them are there to graze the kelp. Now, again, not a lot of you got this correct. I understand that. I understand it, number one, because it's long and you had to read it. I understand it, number two, because it's a thinking question. I really had to think. I understand it, number three, because you had to know what a keystone species is. So don't beat yourself up about this if you got this incorrect, but do notice the test taking techniques that I used. Number one, I read the question. I read the question really more than once. I read each answer. Eliminated the ones that obviously didn't make sense. I was down to two. And then I really reached out and I'm like, okay, what is that definition of a keystone species? And I had to really pull from things that we talked about in class, as far as the red cockaded woodpecker and the gopher tortoise being keystone species. And I had to think, well, they had something to do with more than one organism in that ecosystem. So I understand. If you didn't get it right, take those test taking techniques that I just told you about and apply them when you see this in another exam. Many species representing multiple taxonomic classes are dependent on the red cockaded woodpecker species for cavities it creates. Red cockaded woodpecker cavities create cavity habitat for 7 species of birds, 2 species of squirrels, skinks, frogs, spiders, moths, and numerous species of Hymenoptera. So this is really a level 1 to level 2 question, because it's wanting to know what is the definition of these words right here. Okay, and remember, an invasive species. We have been learning about invasive species in the in fourth period. These are things that come in and they just take over. They come from somewhere else. They don't belong there, and they um, crowd out and disable the native species. All right, keystone species. This makes a lot of sense because we see that the red cockaded woodpecker does something that helps out many different species, not just one species, but many species in that ecosystem. So keystone species is the correct answer. Disruptive species and directional species, these don't make any sense. We've not covered any kind of words like that. So the correct answer is B. And that's a low level question. All right, another one, very similar to the one we had before. Longleaf pine forests are home to hundreds of unique plant and animal species. Approximately 900 plant species are found in longleaf pine forest ecosystems. So, which of the following describes the longleaf pine? It's going to be a keystone species. It is not an invasive species. It belongs here. Humans were the ones that went and cut them down. It is just not a disruptive species. It's not a convergent species, but it's very important. It says that approximately 900 plant species are only found here. That's why, again, you've got one organism that affects many different species. So it's a keystone species. Definition type question, low level question. The gopher tortoise is a federally considered threatened in its western range, and all states throughout the species range offer protection. The gopher tortoise is considered a blank species, as burrows dug by the tortoise are relied upon by over 350 species, such as mice, snakes, frogs, and small mammals. Again, keystone species. So if you have a question where you're talking about one thing is so very important to many other things, then it is going to be a keystone species.